Assalamualaikum, my name is Nazma Khatun. I'm a life coach, I'm a psychotherapist and a counsellor. And today I'd like to talk to you about how to talk to children when we go through a divorce. Talking to children is one of the biggest fears that we have as mothers when we go through divorce because we want to look after their welfare, we're not sure what to tell them depending on the circumstances, we're having to look after our own emotional well-being and also theirs. So I've come up with 7 parts to this and I'm going to go through them one by one with you. Hopefully you can take these points and then apply them into your own life. Okay, rule number 1, which is the biggest rule that I think I had for me when I went through my divorce. I was in an abusive relationship for about 10 years. My ex-husband was narcissistic. I had a 9-month-old and a 3-year-old, and I left that relationship at that time. And I remember one of the things that I worried about most is how to tell my daughter that her dad was narcissistic and how to tell my daughter that I'd gone through abuse. And I knew that it wouldn't come up straight away because she was so little, but I also knew that she'd have questions. So the first thing I would say to you is, number 1, always be honest, okay? It's so easy when you're going through those emotions and you're overwhelmed and you're hurt and sometimes you're even resentful. Sometimes you want to take revenge because of the way that you've been hurt. Other times it could be that it ended well and amicably. But whichever way it happened, always be honest. Because in the end, your children will grow up and they will wonder what happened. And the last thing you want to do is cloud their memories with your hurt. And you don't want to do that. You want to keep it factual and you want to keep it honest. And remember, on the day of judgment, Allah SWT will ask us, yes, we were hurt, yes, things happened, but we don't want to use our children as tools. And I see this so often where people are using their children as a tool to either hurt their partner or to win, points, almost like, my children will look after me. So I think it's important, number 1, is to always be honest with yourself and honest with your children. And that doesn't necessarily mean about telling them inappropriate things at the right age. For example, when my daughter was 3 and she would say, where's my dad? I'd just say, he lives in a separate house, because that's all she really needs to know at that age. Now that she's older, she asks me more sophisticated questions and I'm able to explore that with her, and I will go into that and how I do that. Number 1, always be honest. Number 2 is children can often blame themselves and we might not know it. So it's really important to reassure your children that it wasn't their fault and that things happen between adults. And sometimes relationships don't work out. And sometimes, people fall out with each other. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that marriages are supposed to be places that are safe and people are supposed to get on in those marriages. And if that doesn't happen, Allah allows us to separate. But that isn't a reflection on them, that they didn't do anything for that to happen, that they didn't have a part in that. It's so important because oftentimes they can internalize it as, maybe I did something, maybe I could have been kinder, maybe, I caused a lot of pressure. And that then internalizes with the child and they grow up with that, and oftentimes they don't talk about it because as parents, we don't bring that in. So number 2, reassurance. Number 3 is if you've gone through abuse. And I'm going to talk about it in 2 ways. One, marriage where it's separated and you've maybe separated amicably, or even if you have had a few problems, there's been no abuse in the relationship. So the one I'm going to talk about now is the abuse. If you've gone through abuse, then it's important that when your children ask you, why did you leave, that you say, I left because I needed to be safe. Okay? That being in that relationship wasn't safe. That maybe daddy had anger issues, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't tell us to stay in oppression. And it's important that we say that. And and say, look, I wanted to keep you guys safe as well. So if you've got children, say, I want to keep you safe as well. Because it's so important that they know that the reason that you left is because you make empowering choices. That you didn't do it because of a weakness. You did it because of a strength. Because you decided that you were worth something, that you needed to get yourself out of that. And also it takes away for the next generation this idea of shame, that somehow being divorced or walking away is shameful. It's not. if you're in an abusive relationship, it's actually empowering and honourable to walk away, because it takes a lot of strength and courage to do that. So that's number 3. If you're in an abusive relationship, explain that you did it to be safe and to keep your children safe. Okay. Number 4. Do they have questions? I see this a lot where moms or dads, depending on who's going to watch this, but we don't often ask them if they have any questions. I always check in with my children and I say, do you remember us separating? Do you have any thoughts around it? Do you have any ideas? Do you have any questions? Mama was willing to answer any questions that you have. And as they grow, they might have different questions because they get older and their thinking changes. Sometimes they'll just say, no, I don't have any questions, but that's okay. So what you want to do is check in with your children, and as they ask questions, help them to process through their own questions and their own minds and their own ideas that they might have around the divorce. They might ask things like, why did Daddy leave? Or why did you leave? Or why did you fight? And just answer them honestly, but age appropriate. That's what I would do. Answer them, but answer them age appropriate. Okay. Number 5. They will follow your lead. So the more acceptant you are of divorce, the more acceptant of you are of who you are, the more your children will see that and thrive. I see often we have these stories that we tell ourselves. Okay, I do coaching with women, I do world-class coaching, I do coaching with coaches, and one of the things that is most powerful is the stories that we tell ourselves. And if we act as the victim and we act like, somehow everything was wrong, then those children sense that fear and they sense that instability. So I would always say, work on you and show up as someone who made an empowering choice, and that you weren't the victim, that things happen and you made choices and this is where you are. And that divorce is okay. As long as you've, gone through all of the possibilities that you could have done and you've tried everything and it didn't work out, Allah SWT allows divorce, especially if you're in abuse, or especially if things aren't working out and you're trying and you're trying and you're trying, then it's important that you walk away, because staying in that environment doesn't help our children and doesn't help us. It only teaches them habits and patterns of a relationship that's dysfunctional, and that's not what we want. I would say work on you, get some coaching, get some therapy, find out what happened for you, how it was for you, explore, heal, grow, learn from that and find an empowering story that your children can relate to. And so that if they ever faced an adversity, or if, Allah forbid, they ever had to go through divorce, they would know on what reasons that they would get divorced, and what reasons that, we accept for ourselves. What's the standard that we set as women for ourselves to say this is acceptable, but this isn't, and that there's no shame. Oftentimes I see that there's an underlying current of shame. I don't want to talk about it. The norm is to be married, and the people who are married are somehow more so in worthiness than the people who are not married and divorced. And that's not true. In the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we're all equal. Because the Prophet, remember in the Quran, it talks about the women and marry those who are single or divorced as long as they are pious. So he doesn't say marry all the single ones that are pious. He says we're looking for piety. And as long as we nurture that in ourselves, our worthiness is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not because we're married or not married. Because you could be in a marriage and it'd be so disruptive, and your behaviours and your character in that marriage the worst of you comes out, and you don't want that. You don't want that. So you want to be in an environment that brings out the best in you. So look after yourself. Look after yourself. Find an empowering story, because your children will pick that up, and that will then rub on to how they interpret that situation. Okay. And lastly, if the children are seeing their father, or if they're not. So in an abusive relationship, it might be that the children can't have access to their dad. Maybe he was abusive to them. Just be honest and say to them, look, the reason that you're not seeing your dad is because it's not safe. Maybe one day dad will want to see you when he's worked things out for himself. But right now, it's not safe. And that doesn't make you any less. It doesn't mean that maybe he doesn't love you any less. It just means that our safety is important. And explain to them what love is. People who love us don't hurt us. And it's okay that even with our parents, that sometimes some parents are absent. And that's not shameful, that's no reflection on their worthiness. Because the Prophet ﷺ, his parents died when he was young, but he became one of the best people in the world. So it's not based on whether we have two parents or one parent, it's based on how we approach the trials that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sets us. So I want you to remember that when you've gone, if the children aren't seeing their father because of the abuse, just say to them it's not safe and that's the decision we've made. Maybe when you're older, you might want to. But right now, that can't happen because you're children and my priority is to look after you. And Allah will ask me on the day of judgment why I didn't do that. But for the parents whose dads are, for the children whose fathers are in their life, please, 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 don't cloud your children's view of their father. Don't use your hurt to make them feel like, kind of a resentment towards their dad or change their viewpoint. And if the father is doing that, all you have to do is be the best that you can be. You can't change what he tells them. And you know what? Children are really insightful. When they grow up, they'll know who was honest and who wasn't. They just do. Your job is to know that with Allah, you were clear. And with Allah, you didn't character defame. And with Allah, you didn't slander or backbite your husband, ex-husband. You were just honest with the kids. And allow them to see. Allow them to visit. Don't cloud their judgment on that. Don't put your stuff onto them. Because if he is wanting to see them, don't use your children against that. Because the children do need their fathers. And if they can have access to that relationship, that's a big part of their upbringing. Let them have that and let them enjoy that. And you nurture that as well. Because at the end of the day, a lot of fathers don't want to see their kids. I'm in that situation where my ex doesn't want to see his children. And I can't force that on him. And there are fathers who are bending over backwards to see their kids. And it's not happening. Just find that balance for yourself. The more secure you are, the more able that you have processed, like the more able you are to say, this is my stuff, this is his stuff, but this is what my children need. And you can put that first and you can hold back your stuff. Believe me, those children will really thank you for that one day. I hope that helps. If anybody wants to get in touch with me, you can do. It's Nazma Khatun. I'm on Facebook. You can message me. I always reply to my PMs. If anybody wants to get in touch with me, I'm more than happy to speak to you about any coaching or any advice. You can message me on Facebook, or you can go onto my website, which is nazmakhatunofficial.com, and you can find lots of resources on there. I'll also be on YouTube doing lots of resources there this year. So inshallah, have a look for me, Nazma Khatun. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.